Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're re-diving into one of the most important yet often overlooked wars of the 20th century, the Algerian War of Independence. Fought between 1954 and 1962, this conflict wasn't just Algeria's fight for freedom from French colonial rule. It was a brutal and symbolic struggle that shook the foundations of colonial empires around the world. By the end of this war, over 1 million lives were affected, and Algeria stood as a beacon of anti-colonial resistance. But the road to independence was long, violent, and complex. So let's break it all down. How did it start? What happened during the war? And why does it still matter today? First, we need to rewind the clock to 1830 when France invaded Algeria. What began as a military campaign turned into full-scale colonization. Over the next 120 years, Algeria wasn't just a colony. It was made part of France itself, known as French Algeria. Here's the thing, while settlers called the Pieds Noirs enjoyed land, privilege, and rights, the native Algerian majority, predominantly Muslim, were systematically marginalized. They faced poverty, limited education, and little political voice. By the mid-20th century, the inequalities were glaring. About 1 million Europeans lived in Algeria alongside 9 million indigenous Algerians, yet the Europeans dominated everything: land, power, and wealth. The growing resentment and nationalism among Algerians simmered for decades. Leaders like Messali Hadj and others started planting the seeds of resistance, but things came to a boil after World War II. France had fought to defeat fascism, yet continued to oppress Algeria, hypocrisy that fueled the push for independence. By the early 1950s, Algerian nationalists realized that peaceful negotiations weren't working. This led to the creation of the National Liberation Front, or FLN, in 1954. Now, the FLN wasn't just a political group. It was a revolutionary movement determined to use guerrilla warfare to kick the French out of Algeria. On November 1, 1954, the FLN launched a series of coordinated attacks across Algeria. This date is known as Toussaint Rouge, or Red All Saints' Day. It wasn't a huge military success, but it marked the beginning of the war. France responded brutally. Their goal was to crush the FLN quickly, but their methods, mass arrests, torture, and retaliation, only fueled more anger and support for the independence movement. So, what did this war actually look like? The FLN didn't have the resources for traditional warfare, so they relied on guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, sabotage, and ambushes. The French, on the other hand, deployed over 500,000 troops to Algeria, including elite paratroopers. One of the most infamous episodes was the Battle of Algiers in 1956-1957. The FLN carried out bombings and assassinations in Algiers, and the French military responded with extreme force. The French army introduced the widespread use of torture to extract information from FLN suspects, something that remains controversial to this day. This was no longer just a war, it was a brutal conflict where civilians paid the heaviest price. Villages were destroyed, people were displaced, and both sides were responsible for atrocities. In France, the war divided public opinion. Some supported the military's actions, while others, like philosophers Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, spoke out against the violence and colonialism. Meanwhile, the FLN gained international recognition and support from countries like Egypt, Morocco, and the Soviet Union. The war became a symbol of anti-colonial struggle worldwide. By 1958, France faced a political crisis at home. The war was dragging on, and tensions were rising. Enter Charles de Gaulle, a war hero who returned to power as France's president. At first, de Gaulle seemed like a hope for both sides. The Europeans in Algeria hoped he'd protect their interests, while the FLN hoped he'd grant independence. But de Gaulle played his cards carefully. He realized that keeping Algeria was unsustainable militarily, economically, and morally. In 1960, de Gaulle shocked many when he publicly stated that Algerians had the right to determine their future. This angered French settlers and military leaders, leading to attempted coups and rebellions by the French far right. Despite the chaos, de Gaulle stayed firm. By 1961, negotiations between the FLN and the French government began. On March 18, 1962, the war officially ended with the Évian Accords, a peace agreement granting Algeria its independence. A referendum was held in July, and over 99% of Algerians voted for independence. On July 5, 1962, Algeria was finally free. But freedom came at a devastating cost. Over 1 million Algerians died. Tens of thousands of Europeans, the Pieds Noirs, fled Algeria, leaving everything behind. The war left deep scars on both Algerian and French societies. For Algeria, independence was only the beginning. The FLN became the ruling party, and the country faced decades of political and economic challenges. For France, the war forced a painful reckoning with its colonial past, and the use of torture remains a dark chapter in its history. So, why does this war matter today? The Algerian War wasn't just about Algeria, it was a turning point for the global fight against colonialism. After Algeria's independence, other African nations began pushing harder for freedom, and the colonial empires of Europe began to crumble. It also raised important questions about human rights, warfare, and the cost of colonial oppression, questions that are still relevant today. In Algeria, the war is remembered as a heroic struggle, a cornerstone of their identity. In France, it's a topic that still sparks debate and reflection. Ultimately, the Algerian War reminds us that freedom often comes at an unimaginable cost, but the fight for dignity and independence is a universal story. All right, that's it for today's deep dive into the Algerian War of Independence. This war may not always make it into mainstream history discussions, but its impact on Algeria, France, and the wider world was massive. If you found this video insightful, let me know your thoughts in the comments. What other historical events would you like me to cover? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.